Good evening. Who's out there? Time for more scary stories from the Magic Library. It's David Domine. Friday night, our 13th night together. If you're out there, check in, say hi, let us know where you're from. Grab your bourbon. Wendy, Beth, and we'll get started. Deanna, Donnie, welcome back. Hey, Jessica. Hello, Laura. Wendy's drinking maker. Surprise, surprise. Chris. Hey, Cynthia. Yeah, so did everyone have a good day today? Hey, Lisa. Hey, Sue. Eileen. Jamie. Hi. Hey, Mike. So yeah, if you're just checking in, let people know where you're from. Say hi. Let us know city, state. If you're out of country, let us know. Tell us what you're drinking. And this is the 13th night now that we're getting together and trying to while away the quarantine hours. Hey, Claudia. So I had a nice little surprise today. Beth and Chris left something on our front porch. I came out. Nice bottle of Woodford Reserve, Old Forester. Can you see that? Yep. So that's what I'm drinking tonight. Woodford Reserve. So grab your bourbon and let's settle in. Hey, Lisa. Lisa, cousin Lisa and Lisa Wilder Elbeck. Good seeing you. Cheers. So if you were here last night, we read the second installment of chapters from Voodoo Days at La Casa Fabulosa, my memoir about the time I lived in a supposedly haunted house. Hey, Jill, good to see you back. And we left off with another cliffhanger. So we had moved into the house. We got settled. I started to find out things about the house. Hi, Lori. Hey, Bonnie. And I did some research and found out the house was built in about 1895. The first owner, it appears, was a man named Jacob Whitmer, who was a tobacco man. And went to bed one night after setting the table for a nice Victorian dinner party I planned on having the next night as a way of welcoming everyone to the house. And I kept waking up in the middle of the night, kept hearing crashes, and we'd go search the house, try to find out what was going on, and we could never figure out where these noises were coming from. So I got very little sleep that night. I finally dragged myself out of bed at 6 a.m, decided to get my day started. But when I walked into the dining room, I had a bit of a surprise because there was a chair blocking the entrance going into the butler's pantry. So I moved the chair back to the table, and when I turned around, I was kind of in for a big surprise. And that's where we left off. And so the chapter closed with, "That's when I froze, failing to comprehend the scene before me. 'Ramon,' I yelled, 'come down here right now.'" And so we're going to pick up from that chapter starting right now. And the next chapter is called Josephine. And we're going to do 3 or 4 chapters tonight. These are all pretty short chapters, so we'll probably get done a little before 10. But when I'm done, if you have any questions, just make sure you let me know. All right? So we're starting with Josephine. It took several more shouts before Ramon dragged himself out of bed and came down to the dining room, his dark hair matted over to one side. He stood and looked at me. "What?" He rubbed the sleep from his eyes and yawned. "Did you do this?" I opened my arms and extended them in the direction of the dining room table. He turned his head and studied the room. The dining room was not as I had left it the previous evening. Half of the chairs had been moved from the table and scattered in different parts of the room. And on the table, which I had so carefully set the night before, plates, silverware, and wine glasses had been moved around. And the best part, several of the napkins I had folded in the shape of the fleur-de-lis had been unfolded and lay crumpled on top of respective place settings. It almost looked as if people had gotten up from a meal at the table where someone had been having a dinner party without me. "I didn't do that," he said matter-of-factly. "I haven't gotten out of bed since we came down, and it was fine then." Then his eyes narrowed suspiciously at me. "You sure you didn't do it?" "Yeah, right," I retorted. "I'm going to mess up the table I spent so much time setting yesterday." Off in the distance, a rooster crowed, and Ramon walked to the window, opened the shutter, and looked out. Why the heck is there a rooster crowing in old Louisville? In the fading darkness, several rosy fingers of light crept behind the bare outline of a tree, an eerie confirmation that the sun would soon be up. "I don't know why there's a rooster crowing in old Louisville," I said. "Maybe we're turning into Key West, and before you know it, we'll have wild chickens scratching all over the place and six-toed Hemingway cats sleeping on all the rooftops, but I really don't care, because all I'm concerned about at the moment is finding out who messed up my dining room table. Thank you very much." "Well, maybe you were sleepwalking or something." Ramon yawned, still gazing out into the back alley. "I don't think so. I've never been known to sleepwalk before." I surveyed the disorder in the room and went to join him at the window. "And besides, I didn't really get any sleep. I'm sure it has something to do with those weird noises before." "Well, I'm going back to bed. Maybe someone's playing a practical joke on us." He patted across the floor and into the foyer before disappearing up the steps. As I stared out the window, Ramon's footsteps creaked overhead, and I was left alone to ponder the possibilities. Actually, we did have friends who would pull such a prank, but none of them had keys to get inside. In addition, there was no evidence that anyone had gained entrance to the house either. Besides, who'd get up in the middle of the night when it was cold and blustery outside and make the trip to our place for a joke? I wondered if the animals could have disturbed the table, but the dogs had never left the second floor, and the little black cat was still hiding inside the tiny bathroom closet most of the time. Even if she had ventured forth, the doors to the dining room had been closed. It didn't make sense. The strange dining room antics proved to be a lively topic of conversation when it came time for the dinner party. More than one person was convinced the Widmer house was haunted. "Well, if there's a ghost here and it wants me to believe," I said, "it had better show up and introduce itself. Otherwise, I don't plan on believing in ghosts." Later that night, after all the banter and speculation had died down, we all sat around the table in the dining room and nursed glasses of port. The dinner party had been a huge success, and we all vowed we wouldn't touch another morsel of food for a month, or at least till the next time we got together. Once the dessert was finished, we got up from our chairs and walked into the parlor for a bourbon nightcap before everyone headed out into the cold weather. As she approached the warmth of the fire, Laura stopped dead in her tracks and looked out the front arched window into the yard. "Who is that?" She raised her finger and pointed at the patch of grass outside. A black silhouette hovered, outlined by the eerie glare of the street lamp. "What the?" I bumped into her and almost dropped the decanter of bourbon I had snagged from the console in the foyer. "What are they doing in the front yard?" I said, craning my neck to better see the figure outside. I maneuvered my way around the others, who were backed up behind us, and walked to the front door and opened it. From the porch, I walked down the steps and slowly approached the form in the front yard. It appeared to be an elderly woman in long skirts with a shawl draped over her shoulders. Something like a turban sat on her head. I couldn't be sure, but it looked like the person I had seen in the back alley after moving into the house. Mesmerized, she stared into the front window. "Can I help you?" I asked. Startled, the woman jumped back and looked at me. Without a word, she raised the crook of her arm to shield her face and bounded away over the hedge. Although dead leaves and frozen grass covered the yard, she didn't make the slightest sound as she ran away. Watching her disappear from sight, I went back up the steps and returned to the warmth of the house. "Who was that?" Wendy met me in the foyer and gave me a quizzical look. "Was it another panhandler?" "I don't know," I said. "It looked like some voodoo lady or something." In the parlor, Beth held out a tumbler of bourbon, which I gratefully accepted. "Well, what did she want?" asked Laura. "I don't know. She didn't say anything." I took a swallow and enjoyed the warmth searing the back of my throat. I asked her what she wanted, and she raised her arm like she was a vampire who had just seen a crucifix. Then she bounded over the hedge and ran down towards Oak Street. Well, she'll fit right in on Oak, said Skippy. He drained the last of his bourbon and held his hands out to the fire. She's probably going over to the corner of 4th and Crazy to see who the other nutcases are and who's out and about tonight. Maybe they can get a musical act together and take their show on the road. Maybe it's Josephine, said Laura. Who the heck is Josephine? Laura looked out the front window for signs of any other visitors before hugging her shawl tighter around her neck. Well, I was talking to one of your neighbors before I came in tonight, and they were telling me about some of the more interesting characters who live around here. She's supposed to be one of them. Josephine? Yes, from what they say, she's an old voodoo lady who grew up in this area. They say her name's Josephine. Laura returned her attention to the small crowd in front of her and smiled. Maybe it was her. Voodoo in Kentucky? I swirled the remaining bit of bourbon in my glass and then raised it to my lips. Did we even have voodoo in these parts? Of course we did, said Skippy, the amateur historian. Back when people still got around by steamboats, anything that was in New Orleans eventually ended up in Louisville. Around here they used to call it hoodoo, though. Oh, great. I reached for the bourbon. Now we've got to worry about witch doctors and voodoo queens in addition to all the people who are playing crazy around here. I went to stand with Laura at the window, and we looked out across the front yard. A tall African-American man came walking down the middle of the street. He wore a long black coat and carried a violin case at his side. Oh, who's that? Said Laura. I've seen him around before. I forget his name, I said, but I used to see him a lot when I was at the University of Louisville. You talking about Micah? Wendy took a drink of bourbon and swirled the ice cubes around in her tumbler. You see him all over town, always with his violin case. Yeah, that's it, I said. Micah. I left the window and plopped myself down in an armchair by the fire. Not quite sure what his story is, but you really do see him all over the place. I stretched my feet out toward the fire and smiled. I don't know about the rest of you, but I sort of like the fact that we have a guy with a violin regularly strolling around our city. It adds a lot of culture, and I hope we see him down here a lot in old Louisville. I sighed, and if you ask me, we can always make do with another interesting character or two. Beth laughed a bit and nestled into her corner of the sofa. Well, you guys can't say you didn't pick a colorful neighborhood, can you? Never a dull moment down here. I filled my glass and passed around the bourbon for those wanting a refill, which was everyone. It was cold outside, but whiskey was keeping things nice and warm at Widmer House. So that was the chapter about Josephine. So if you're just joining us, welcome. Let us know where you're from, say hi, and tell us what you're drinking tonight. I'm doing Woodford Reserve, so cheers, and let's go on to the next chapter. So once again, reading from my memoir, Voodoo Days at La Casa Fabulosa, my 12th book, a memoir about the time I lived in a supposedly haunted house in old Louisville, one of the largest historic preservation districts in the neighborhood. And because of the quarantine, I'm not out and about like I normally would be, giving tours of the neighborhood with my tour company, Louisville Historic Tours. So for the time being, I'll just make do by going live every night at 9 o'clock. The last week and a half, we spent listening to ghost stories from my book, True Ghost Stories, and Eerie Legends from America's Most Haunted Neighborhood, which is this book, the book before my memoir. And we went through those stories rather quickly, so for the next 2 weeks or so, like I said, we're going to do this, my memoir. By the way, we were introduced to the dogs we had at the time last, and I showed you pictures of Rocky and Bess, but here's a picture of Fritz, the little schnauzer we got when we lived there, and I actually dedicated my first book to him. He was a little silver schnauzer. He was a sweet little boy. And he's wearing my cashmere sweater that I accidentally washed on hot, and it shrunk down to the size of a baby sweater, so he used to wear that. But that's Fritz, so you hear a lot about him in this book. And If you haven't been on our website, check it out, LouisvilleHistoricTours.com. We've got information about the tours, a blog, keeping people updated. You can get some merchandise there. Like I said, the merchandise is slowly rolling out, but thanks to Sean Stafford and Hunley Media for doing a lot of great work. Thanks to Carrie Sweet for helping us come up with new logos. We got a batch of t-shirts in already. We got more on the way, so we're doing lots of things to brand and market old Louisville. So when the time is right and you can get out and about, you can come down and check out the neighborhood for yourself. So we're going to go on to the next chapter, which is a short one, and this one is called The Corner of 4th and Crazy. So the good thing about February is that it only lasts 28 days. Most years, that is. March finally arrived in old Louisville, and with it the anticipation of spring. Although patches of ice and snow still crusted the ground, residents could taste the end of winter, and they nervously paced their warm parlors and paneled libraries like caged animals. They longed for a warm breeze and a bit of grass. So did the people, who were often found near the corner of 4th and Oak Streets. Old Louisville is a unique neighborhood, to say the least. Aside from civic-minded residents and spectacular architecture, it has its fair share of problems as well. And part of this is an image problem that goes way back to the 60s and 70s, when many considered old Louisville a seedy and unsafe part of the city. So despite the gentrification that has taken place, many old-timers still think of it as a bad part of town today. Granted, old Louisville is almost downtown, so it does have the normal troubles you'd find in the center of any larger city in the country. But in Louisville, people's perceptions don't always match up with reality. The purported crime rate is sometimes higher than other parts of town, a fact that is hardly surprising given the higher density of residents in a single square block compared to other Louisville neighborhoods. But a lot of the criticism has to do with the panhandlers and the loiterers who sometimes prowl Oak Street after hitting up one of the many charitable or social service agencies located in old Louisville, or after trying to find day jobs at a local employment agency. Often, they congregate at the corner of 4th and Oak Streets. Back before my time, right as the hippies were petering out of existence in old Louisville, locals called the corner of 4th and Oak 4th and Fellini, because at any given moment you might come across a scene straight out of the famous Italian director's films, or maybe something totally unexpected like a group of men dressed as nuns, or a woman in a purple sleeping bag with 2 armholes cut out standing up and playing Claire de Lune on the saw. But most call it the corner of 4th and Crazy nowadays. You'll still find the occasional man in a nun's habit. In fact, most of the populace at 4th and Crazy still count as nothing more than eccentric. However, you'll also find a random hustler, an aggressive transsexual prostitute, or a drug dealer thrown in the mix. It makes life in old Louisville interesting. One day in March, as winter was loosening its grasp on the neighborhood, I was driving to work and noticed a man kneeling at the bus stop at 4th and Oak. I couldn't figure out why he was hunched over the way he was. Then I saw that he was chewing on a corner of the long wooden seat that comprised most of the base of the bench under the little bus stop hut. When I drove back home later in the day, I noticed that a large chunk had been gnawed from the bench. Another day, there was a corpulent man in a shamrock print caftan playing the bongos on top of the little waiting hut. Don't ask me how he crawled up there. The next night, 3 drag queens in tight-fitting sequin gowns were up there, apparently rehearsing a Supremes number. I hoped it was Baby Love, but I had the windows up as I drove by, so I couldn't know for sure. Whitmer House was right around the corner from 4th and Crazy. If you walked out the back door of 1228 South 3rd Street to the alley and went down 4 or 5 houses and turned left, you were there. Nonetheless, I was still surprised when I drove by the corner on my way to the grocery store one day in March and noticed a very large man sitting on the infamous bench at the bus stop. He was totally naked and contentedly sat there, presumably waiting for the bus. I recognized him as a local artist who's known for his colorful streetscapes of different parts of the city, but I had never seen him unclothed at the bus stop before. Come to think of it, I had never seen anyone fully unclothed at the bus stop before. The man just sat there and grinned at passers-by, his big, eyes wider than usual. When I passed by the corner again 15 minutes later, 4 squad cars had pulled up and an officer had draped an army-issue woolen blanket over the man. With wide eyes, the large man kept looking back and forth at passing cars and smiled, waving every now and then. The policemen scratched their heads and paced around. The next day, when I drove by the bus stop on the way to the grocery store to get some things to test a new batch of recipes, Newt Fat Guy was gone, replaced by a tall individual with a beach ball-striped propeller beanie like little boys used to wear in the mid-1900s and the 1950s. He was keeping time with his left foot and appeared to be playing an imaginary set of drums. Next to him stood Josephine. Immediately, I slowed the car down for a better look, nonetheless trying to be inconspicuous. A heavy brown skirt hung down below the woman's knees, leather sandal straps curling around her ankles. Although the air was warm, she had on a bulky knit sweater and wore the same turban from the night before. At least I thought it was the same turban. Truth be told, I couldn't even be certain it was the same woman. She seemed to have a serene smile on her face, but that quickly vanished when she caught sight of my gaze. Again, she raised her arm and covered her face, quickly turning away from me and running down the sidewalk. My eyes widened and I shook my head and chuckled. "What is going on with that woman?" I said to no one in particular. "I don't even know her, but I guess I did something to get on her bad side." All right, so that was our short little chapter about Josephine. So time for another toast. So cheers. Thanks to Chris and Beth for supplying me with a nice bottle of Woodford Reserve today. And welcome if you're just joining us. Continuing our third night of reading from Voodoo Days at La Casa Fabulosa, my 12th book, a memoir about the time I lived in a supposedly haunted house on Millionaire's Row in Old Louisville. If you're just checking in, say hi, let people know where you're from and what you're drinking. Okay, so the next short chapter is called Voodoo Days, so it kind of explains where the title of the book comes from. So, Voodoo Days. Frankly, I found it odd that there was a supposed voodoo lady running around the neighborhood. Not because I was afraid she'd turn me into a zombie or anything, but because once or twice a year, I'd experience something I call a voodoo day. I made up the name when I was in my adolescent years and it has stuck ever since. As far as I know, there's no actual voodoo involved, but voodoo seemed as good a choice as any to describe the weird kind of days where random coincidences always seemed to converge in large numbers in my life. They started right around age 12 for me and waned in their frequency the older I got, but nonetheless, I could count on 1 or 2 full-blown voodoo days a year. When I moved into the Widmer house, the frequency of my voodoo days seemed to increase dramatically. When I was a teenager, most of my voodoo days centered on the television. No doubt because all we ever did was sit around and watch TV at home. Typical shows involved were Gilligan's Island or The Brady Bunch, sometimes Hogan's Heroes or One Day at a Time. The way a voodoo day would work is that I, out of the blue, would find myself thinking about something I had seen on TV. And then that very scene or episode would be on the television sometime in the next 24 hours. And not just that either, the exact scene would be on as the television was turned on or when changing the channel. That would then be the precursor to something peculiar happening. For example, I'd be lying awake in bed on a Saturday morning, and for some reason the episode from Gilligan's Island where they find the giant spider in the cave would pop up in my head, and I chuckle to myself, remembering how fake the huge spider looked, its big old phony legs stiffly moving up and down as it crawled to the mouth of the cave. Then I'd get up and get a bowl of Captain Crunch for breakfast, and what would be on TV when I turned it on? The very first thing to pop up on the screen would be the goofy spider thrashing its fake legs in the cave as it chased Gilligan around. Then there'd be a knock at the door of our house, and a gypsy man would be standing there. Not a real gypsy, but a man dressed as a gypsy who would ask if he could use the phone because his car had broken down. And his car would be a red double-decker bus like the kind they drive around in London. We lived in the middle of nowhere in the backwoods of Wisconsin, and you never saw men dressed up as gypsies, much less driving double-decker buses down a remote gravel road at 9 in the morning. What were the chances of that? And then later in the day, something else weird would happen. Like, I'd look out the front window, and there would be 7 black dogs of all different sizes and shapes lined up, sitting in a perfect row, looking at me as if they knew I'd be coming all along. Maybe they wanted a treat. Once I was sitting in Mrs. Norton's class at school, and for some reason I started to think about a Brady Bunch episode, the one where they were on vacation in Hawaii and Greg wiped out on his surfboard and they all thought he had drowned. When I got home that afternoon and walked through the door, the TV was blaring, and on it I saw Greg on his surfboard just a second before he wiped out. 2 hours later, the phone rang, and it was someone in Ireland who dialed the wrong number and got mad and wouldn't believe me when I told her I really wasn't her nephew in Galway trying to play a practical joke on her with a bad American accent. Then, at supper time, I was amazed to see that the first mouthful of alphabet soup I had spooned up advised me to be a man, and the pasta letters were perfectly spaced and straight. Those were voodoo days. The older I got, the less frequent my voodoo days became, due in no small part, I'm sure, to the reduced hours in front of the television set, even though others have told me that pubescent individuals are often most susceptible to paranormal phenomena. I don't know if I describe my voodoo days as supernatural, but I do know they started increasing in frequency after we took up residence at Widmer House. The first voodoo day I recalled at the house on 3rd Street started off with a bundle of sticks. I had gotten out of bed late one weekend morning when the sun was shining and the day was starting to warm up a teensy bit after a very chilly night. Standing at the front window, I watched as a blonde woman in black strolled by, perhaps headed to Oak Street. Several minutes later, another female figure passed by in the same direction, this one wearing all black as well, and also sporting a head of long blonde hair. The next 2 people who walked by, not as a pair, but separately, also were women in black slacks and black tops, and both had very, very long hair. The 5th person to pass was a neighborhood character known as Tina, famous for the head of long bleach blonde hair that went all the way down to her ankles, and she was dressed all in black as well. What were the odds of 5 people passing by, all in the same direction, all wearing solid black, and all having extremely long blonde hair? I chuckled and walked into the foyer. Coffee cup in hand, I opened the front door and prepared to step out onto the porch to better survey my domain. As I took my first step, something down on the tile floor of the porch caught my eye, and I had to swerve to the right to avoid stepping on it. When I reached to pick it up, I discovered a small bundle of sticks tied together with a willow branch. The sticks were maybe 12 inches at the longest, and there might have been 20 or 30 of them in all. It looked like the perfect little bundle of kindling, so I took it up to the big room with the wood-burning fireplace on the 2nd floor. It would come handy for the next fire. It never crossed my mind to wonder why someone would leave a bundle of kindling on our front steps. It wasn't until later that I thought about Josephine. Later on that day, when I made myself some lunch, something surprising happened when I took the cap off a bottle of beer. When I tossed the bottle top down onto the counter, it landed on its side and balanced in a vertical position while it skidded across the counter, upright. That doesn't happen too often. Then the phone rang and I went to answer it. A woman on the other end asked to speak to David, and when I replied that he was on the line, she just guffawed. By the sound of my voice, she quickly concluded that she had dialed the wrong number, confiding that she was trying to reach a tall blonde guy with schnauzers who taught foreign languages at the university. When I told her she had reached the right person, she laughed and added that the man she was looking for drove a black car and lived in an old house on 3rd Street. Only when she gave the last name of the individual, who was indeed a different person, did we realize a strange coincidence had occurred. When I hung up the phone and returned to the kitchen, the same thing happened when I ate my lunch and when I opened a 2nd bottle of beer. When I tossed the top down onto the counter, it landed upright on its ridged side and stood there until I knocked it down. I guess it shouldn't have been surprising that the day's odd events would herald the beginning of a year of very bizarre occurrences at Widmer House. Okay, So now you know what a voodoo day is. So now we'll do another chapter, and this will probably be our last chapter. So cheers. Doing Woodford Reserve tonight. If you haven't, check out our website and see the great work Sean Stafford has done, LouisvilleHistoricTours.com. Keep an eye out for the merchandise that's coming. Thanks for those that have given me some nice reviews on Amazon for Voodoo Days and True Ghost Stories and Eerie Legends for America's Most Haunted Neighborhood. It really helps to get those reviews on Amazon. And Goodreads, Barnes & Noble as well. Also, Louisville Historic Tours on TripAdvisor. Anything we can do to get the word out about old Louisville. It's helping a lot. Okay, so let me see. Yeah, this is going to be our final chapter. It looks like 3.5 pages. So let me just double check. Well, I'll read this and we'll see how we're doing on the time. Maybe I can squeeze in another one. But I don't think we're going to have a cliffhanger tonight. Yeah, all these other chapters kind of just end. Yeah. All right. So this chapter is called Footsteps on the Stairs. Spring had finally taken hold in old Louisville. It started slowly in late March with the jonquils and crocuses, which soon wilted and made way for the redbud trees. But when April finally arrived, it seemed as if spring had come overnight and the neighborhood had just quickly transformed into a garden of fresh greenery and heavily laden branches ready to erupt. The tulip poplars dropped their huge blossoms and the azaleas and dogwoods started blooming. The smell of new grass and damp soil permeated the air. It was a beautiful sunny morning, and I was in the kitchen, getting ready to test some recipes for a column I was writing for Kentucky Monthly magazine. I took out the needed utensils, and from the refrigerator I removed several blocks of cream cheese and some English cucumbers. From the vegetable baskets under the window by the stove, I got several huge onions and proceeded to chop them. I was writing a piece about Benedictine, a local specialty invented in the late 1800s by Louisville caterer Jenny Benedict, and I had 4 different recipes to compare. Part spread, part dip, it's something that tends to show up on Louisville tables during the holidays and special events. And the Kentucky Derby was right around the corner. Once I had fed the onions into the food processor, I used a cheesecloth to extract all the moisture and then proceeded to combine it with the other ingredients. The antique phone I had refurbished rang, and I went to the front of the house to answer it. A high school friend was calling from her new home in Texas, and she had tracked me down after losing contact several years before. We started catching up, and before long I told her about the recent move. An archaeologist, Mindy, was thrilled to hear about the Widmer house and the historic neighborhood I now called home. She wanted more details and asked if I had found anything left behind by the original families, but the only thing I knew about was a 1907 inspection sheet from the Louisville Electric Company I discovered taped to the door in an old-fashioned fuse cabinet on the 2nd floor. "Do you have any ghosts?" she inquired. I chuckled and told her about the odd noises, the pictures falling, and the several times I had come across the unexplained smell of coffee in the kitchen, but quickly disavowed myself of any real belief in the paranormal. "I'm more concerned about the bats here," I confided. "It seems like they're flying around at all hours, even during the daytime. Isn't that strange? I thought they only came out at night and when it was warm. But I've seen them flying around when it's cold out, too, in broad daylight." I don't know. I'm an archaeologist, not a bat expert," said Mindy. She listened as I recounted some of the details of the strange occurrences from the weeks before, and soon we were laughing and recalling our penchant for telling ghost stories during our high school days back home in Wisconsin. We talked for another half hour or so, and I was getting ready to say goodbye and hang up when I suddenly caught my breath and gasped. Up on the 3rd floor, one of the doors had slammed shut. "What?" Mindy stopped talking while I told her to wait and be quiet for a second. Trying to make as little noise as possible, I went over to the railing and listened. Distinct footsteps had started, and they seemed to be making their way down from the top floor. I looked around and spied a large glass paperweight on the telephone table. With my free hand, I picked it up in case I found myself face to face with an intruder and needed to defend myself. "I think there's someone in the house," I whispered into the receiver. The telephone stood on a small table under the main stairs, and I stretched out the cord to position myself closer to the balustrade to see up into the stairwell. I could see up to the third floor, but all I could see was darkness until the scrolled brass lamp hanging over the topmost landing caught a bit of light and reflected it. It seemed to gently sway in and out of the dim stream of light coming from the door to my office. Ramon was at work, but thinking that perhaps he had come home early, or maybe he had come home for a quick lunch break, as he sometimes did, I called out his name. But I got no answer, so I called out again. The only thing I could hear was distinct footfall, tread by tread, as the steps continued and approached the landing between the second and third floors. Plain as day, it sounded like someone was walking down the stairs, and the ground floor was the destination. "What's going on?" asked Mindy. "Do you need to go?" "Hang on a sec. Someone is coming down the stairs." I paused as the steps made it to the second floor and then started coming down to the last landing. I looked up to the first landing where a shaft of sunlight had illuminated the two stained glass windows and waited. The stairs from the ground floor to the second floor doubled back midway at the landing, obscuring a portion of it from sight. It sounded as if the invisible steps had reached the last landing, and I was waiting for a pair of feet to materialize as they rounded the bend and came down the final section of steps. I held my breath and waited. But the footfall simply faded away, the unknown source concealed in the shadows. I had the distinct impression that someone had just walked all the way down the stairs and stopped at the very last step, necessary for him or her, or whatever it was, to stay out of view. With a clatter, I put the handset down on the little telephone table and flipped on the light in the stairway. "Who's there?" There was no response. So I said it again. When I got no answer, I charged up the stairs, flipping on random lights all the way to the third floor, where all the doors were wide open. Finding no one, I trudged back down to the third floor, or to the first floor. "Is everything okay there?" Mindy's anxious voice crackled from the handset. "Tell me what's happening." I picked up the phone and gave her an update. "I'm fine, but I swear someone was on the steps." I told her I had seen nothing at all and had no idea where the footsteps could have originated, other than on the third floor, where it clearly sounded like someone had slammed a door. Shrugging my shoulders, I finally said it must have been something with a perfectly reasonable explanation. Maybe the timbers expanding and contracting with the warmer weather had caused it. We had hired men to do some odd jobs around the house, so maybe that could have had something to do with it. Maybe your ghost doesn't like what you're doing to the place," suggested my friend. "Remember that old haunted farmhouse off Highway 54 we used to sneak into after theater practice? They said a ghost chased the family off because they inherited the home from a relative, and when they moved in, they started changing things around too much." A slight shiver ran up my spine as I remembered the warning Margaret had given me. I gave a nervous laugh and told Mindy she was not the first one who had come up with that idea. We spoke for several more minutes and then said our goodbyes. I hung up the old phone, and even though it was bright and sunny outside, I made sure to leave the light on in the dark stairwell. Okay, so that's the end of Footsteps on the Stairs. How are we doing on time? Cheers. How are we doing on time? I can't see on mine. Might be able to squeeze in one more. Yeah, we got 5 pages to the next chapter. 9:40. Okay, if it's 9:40, we can squeeze in another chapter. All right. So welcome if you're joining us. Continuing with Voodoo Days at La Casa Fabulosa, my unconventional memoir. All right. Susan, yeah, we got all night. So, all right, this last chapter I'll read is called Louis. And if any of the Thursday/Monday/Tuesday night dinner club is out there, they will probably remember Louis. Ramon just had a habit of hiring anyone to like help us do yard work and stuff, and sometimes he hired the wrong people. So hey, Thomas, and I think I saw VG too, right? So welcome. But yeah, so this last chapter is called Louis. So that year in Louisville, spring was exceptionally beautiful, albeit short. By the start of the Kentucky Derby Festival at the end of April, the early tendrils of summer had already taken hold, and the humidity and warmth in the air hinted at the many sultry evenings that lay ahead. Azalea bushes danced with hundreds of animated blossoms in scarlet, crimson, and fuchsia, and dogwood trees displayed delicate petals of pink and ivory at every turn. Tender sprigs of mint seemed to shoot up wherever a neglected patch of moist soil would permit. Around the gas lamps on St. James Court, where the wrought iron legs of benches dug into the damp earth in Central Park, at foundations and through the cracks in cobblestone and brick courtyards. It seemed that mint was growing everywhere. For most people in Louisville, fresh mint in April means one thing. The Kentucky Derby is right around the corner, and mint juleps are in store. The time when people pull out rare silver cups and cocktail shakers, long-necked spoons passed down from generations and secret family recipes, all in anticipation of the one time of year when even the strictest of teetotalers have been known to allow themselves this one indulgence. Mint juleps and the Kentucky Derby were two of the many things I'd come to love about my move to Louisville in 1993. There was still a lot to do on the house, but the rooms on the bottom floor were presentable, so like many homeowners in old Louisville, we decided to have a derby party. The small yard at the front of the house, on the other hand, was a wreck, and it needed a good bit of landscaping to enhance the curb appeal. Instead of hiring a professional, Ramon one day asked the first guy who walked by if he'd be interested in doing some landscaping work. The man he hired was named Louis, and it turned out that Louis was a familiar local panhandler. He had hit me up for money several times as I walked to the store, and I recognized him right away when Ramon introduced us. "Why don't you call someone from the Yellow Pages?" I asked later, when I got him alone in the kitchen. "I think Louis has some problems. I've seen him passed out at the bus stop at 4th and Crazy 2 or 3 times already. Hate to break it to you, but I don't think he's a qualified landscaper." "Oh, all he needs to do is just plant some things and pull some weeds," said Ramon. "I don't think it will be that hard, and we can help him out." "I know it's not that hard, but garden work might be something of a challenge when you're drunk," I said. "He reeks of alcohol. Didn't you smell it on him? He probably has a drug problem, too. What if he's a crack whore?" "Well, I asked him, and he said he doesn't do drugs. He only likes a drink or two every now and then," he said. With that, Ramon left for the nursery to go get some things for the yard makeover. "I have a feeling he likes a little more than a drink or two," I called after him. Louis started landscaping the week before our derby party. But after 5 days of work, it seemed that little progress had been made. In fact, it seemed like no progress had been made. Several holes had been dug, and a number of plants in plastic containers stood at the ready, waiting for someone to transplant them. But other than that, the front yard looked much the same as it did the day Ramon had hired Louis. "What should I do with this?" Louis asked one sun-filled morning, motioning with his head at the bag of mulch slung over his shoulder. I'd already told him 3 times to spread the mulch over the beds with the newly planted boxwoods along the sidewalk, but I quickly learned the man's short-term memory left a bit to be desired. "Spread it around the boxwoods in the front," I repeated. "There are 10 more bags in the backyard." Then I walked into the house to do some more work in the kitchen. I'd come back from the grocery store and needed to start on the food for the party. Half an hour later, the doorbell rang. I put down a tray of lemon tarts I had taken out of the oven, and I went to open the door. Louis stood there and asked what he should do next. I walked outside to see how the mulching had gone and was surprised to find that absolutely no mulch had been scattered around the boxwood hedges. When I looked over at Louis, I noticed he had taken a swig from a bottle wrapped in brown paper. After wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, he stowed the bottle in his pants pocket. "Where's all the mulch?" I asked. Out front on the sidewalk, There was some movement, and I looked up to see Micah walking by. Clad in a red Louisville Cardinals sweatshirt, he happily swung the violin case at his side and didn't seem to notice us in the front yard. "Up there, around the boxwoods," he said, pointing to the azalea bushes at the front of the house. He smiled, seemingly satisfied with the job he had done. "Well, those are actually the azaleas," I explained. "But no big deal, they needed mulch too." So I guided Louisville over to a large flat of Manhattan bushes, and I gave him his next task. "There are 24 Manhattan bushes here," I said. "Plant a row of 12 to make a border for this side of the yard, and then another dozen in a row to make a border over there. That way the whole yard will have a hedge around it." I took several of the plants and laid them out so he could see exactly what I was talking about. "Okay, Chief," he said. "And those?" he asked, pointing to the 24 hosta plants on the sidewalk. "Once you have the Manhattans planted, do a row of hostas next to them on the inside." I grabbed several hostas and positioned them to give him a visual guide. "Does this make sense?" I asked. "Sure thing, boss." He picked up a Manhattan bush and started to work. "The Manhattan bush is on the outside and the hostas on the inside," I said, simplifying the instructions for good measure. Back in the kitchen, I started grating cheddar for a batch of pimento cheese. When that was done, I mixed it in with a bit of mayonnaise and chopped red peppers. I was debating whether or not to add a dash of Worcestershire sauce when an uneasy feeling came over me, so I decided to go and check on Louis. He already had sunk a good portion of the plants into the ground, but it immediately became apparent that Louis had not understood the instructions. Instead of a row of Manhattan bushes next to a row of hostas, he had started to plant a single row of Manhattan bushes alternating with hostas. No, I said, using a trowel to remove the hosta plants. "Not like that, like this." I transferred Manhattan bushes to the recently vacated holes and started to plant a parallel line of hostas. "When you're done with these 2 rows, do the same thing over there." I indicated the boundary of the yard on the other side of the walkway. "Okay, I see." He bent over and continued to work. "No problem, Chief." I went back inside and added a dash of Worcestershire sauce to the pimento cheese. Then I started a batch of Benedictine. After grating the cucumber and mixing it with cream cheese and parsley pureed with olive oil, I stirred it all together and put it in the refrigerator. I had scooped flour out of the canister to whip up a batch of beaten biscuits when a hunch impelled me to go check on Louis again. He had finished the rows he had started on, but instead of a mirror image on the other side of the yard, he had planted the remaining plants alongside the house. He was sitting on the front steps, the paper-wrapped bottle in one hand. When he saw me, he stood up and put the bottle back in his pocket. A slight groan escaped my lips. That's not quite what I wanted." I pointed to the edge where the plants should have gone. "I wanted them in rows over there." I was going to explain it to Louis once again when I noticed his bloodshot eyes and saw how he had begun to sway back and forth. "Never mind," I said. I started uprooting the hostas and Manhattan bushes and transplanted them myself. Louis grabbed a broom and started sweeping the sidewalk. On the other side of the street, a beat-up Chevy slowly drove by the house. A red-headed woman was leaning out of the passenger side window, and she took a picture with an old Polaroid camera. As the car crept on its way, I saw something else lean out the window behind her. It was an enormous pig, splotched with patches of pink and black, and it stuck its nose out into the air and snorted loudly. "You sure do got some oddballs in this here neighborhood," said Louis. He stood next to me and shook his head. Together, we watched the car disappear from view. Ramon and I had scheduled the party for the next day, and by noon the front yard was in presentable condition. Mounds of purple phlox tumbled over the raised edge of the curb, and the Manhattan bushes formed 2 neat rows on either side of the yard. A tidy row of boxwood hedges stood at the front, welcoming those who came up the walkway. Although the hedgewoods added a great deal of character to the small front yard, the individual bushes seemed tiny and inconspicuous. I wanted to have one of those border hedges that were 8 or 9 feet tall, like the ones I saw down the block. It would take years before the hedge at Widmer House reached these heights, so I resigned myself for the wait. If I had learned one thing during the first half year we were in the house, it was that you needed to have patience if you wanted to live in an old house. Things generally didn't get done overnight. I gave the front yard the once over and went back into the house. Ramon was off running errands, and Louis said he would return in a couple of hours to get some money for his labors. I went up and took a shower, and several hours later I had put on a linen jacket and everything was ready. At the bar we had set up in the front parlor, I made myself a quick mint julep before the first guests arrived. Sipping the sugar-sweetened bourbon, I wandered from room to room and inspected the trays of hors d'oeuvres one final time. In addition to beef tenderloin with Henry Bain sauce, there were beaten biscuits with country ham and little silver dollar rolls with bacon and Benedictine for the real meat eaters. I also had made up trays of sweet potato biscuits with pecan chicken salad and pimento cheese finger sandwiches using recipes from the cookbook that had just come out. And of course, there were lots of sweets. I was setting out a vase with fresh roses next to a dish of pecan fudge when the doorbell buzzed. I went to open it, and Skippy was standing there in a seersucker suit. He zoomed by me and made a beeline to the mint juleps, fluttering a scrap of brown paper in his hand as he walked by. "This was stuck in the iron grate of your front door." After setting down the paper, he filled a glass with crushed ice and added some bourbon. "What is it?" I examined the scrap and wrinkled my nose. A large grease spot stained the center, and illegible handwriting had been scrawled across one side. It looked as if someone had found part of an old grocery bag in the garbage and written a message on it. "Where'd you say you found this?" "It was stuck in your front door. Probably that old Josephine leaving a voodoo curse for you or something like that." Skippy used a large stock of mint to stir his drink and took a swallow. "Well, I don't have time to figure out what it says." I squinted to decipher the words. "The house is going to be full of people in a quarter of an hour, and I need to make sure there's enough ice for the bar." I crumpled the paper and tossed it into a cardboard box I'd set aside for trash. He shook his head and took another drink. "Josephine's not going to like that." "Whatever, she'll have to get over it," I said. An hour later, the house swarmed with people, most wandering around with mint juleps. In the foyer, I stopped to chat with a group of neighbors who had stopped to admire my latest bit of handiwork, several large gold panels with the word welcome stenciled in different languages over several entryways. The idea had come to me, I explained, after discovering a pencil tracing of the German word for welcome on one of the panels. Wondering if it wasn't perhaps a remnant from the first inhabitants, the Widmer family, presumably Swiss speakers of German, I had decided to keep the greeting, misspelling and all, and embellish it to make it part of the decor. In Edwardian script, I traced out black letters on a gleaming gold background, and the result was very eye-catching. The greeting was then repeated in French, English, Arabic, and Esperanto on the neighboring panels. I excused myself to make the rounds and offer bourbon balls to anyone with a sweet tooth when a terrible shriek echoed in the foyer. "Oh, my goodness!" cried a woman. She pointed through the window to the sidewalk that ran between our house and the neighbors. "Who is that?" A spate of concerned murmurs spread through the house, but it soon turned to relieved chuckles when I spied the source of the disturbance and explained that there was no need to worry. It was only Louis. Standing outside the window, in the clothes he had worn the last 5 days, he stared mutely through the window into the foyer like a man in a trance. From the way his body swayed back and forth, I could tell he was under the influence. I ran through the back door to the side yard and pulled him out of view. "What is it, Louis?" I said. "Why were you standing there, staring into the window? You could have just knocked or come around to the back door." "Okie dokie, Chief," he said, his words slurred together. A slight grin formed on his lips, and that's when I saw how dilated his pupils were. At his sides, his hands had started to fidget and twitch. "Did you get my bill for services rendered?" He shuffled his feet and looked away. "Bill? No, I don't recall getting a bill," I said. "No need for a bill anyway, since all you need to do is tell us the hours you worked." "I left it in the front door for you. My invoice." His eyes started to dart back and forth as if he expected someone to come up and startle us. A light bulb went on somewhere. "Oh, that piece of brown paper in the front door? Hang on a sec, I said, and let me get it. I ran into the house to retrieve the crumpled mess from the trash box. Smoothing it out on the railing around the porch, I leaned over and studied the writing a bit more intently. I was able to finally decipher the word invoice at the top and followed several jagged scrawls down to what appeared to be a series of numbers. Yep, that's my invoice, boss. Louis smiled and swatted at something in the air. Rubbing my eyes, I handed the note back to him. Sorry, but you're going to have to read this because I can't make it out, I chuckled. All I see is something that looks like $3,000. That's right. For services rendered, $3,000 is the bill for landscaping your beautiful house. Are you kidding? $3,000? I hoped he was joking, but the petulant look on his face indicated otherwise. Yep, that's right. For services rendered, you owe me $3,000. Louis crossed his arms, which did nothing to help maintain his equilibrium. He lost his balance and had to throw out his arms to balance himself and remain standing. Okay, I took a deep breath to remain calm. There was no way you did $3,000 worth of work. You've only been working for 5 days. My services don't come cheap, he said. $30 an hour is what I charge. Good help is hard to find nowadays. In the first place, I said $30 an hour is outrageous, and besides that, you did not work 100 hours. Yes, I did. Louis crossed his arms resolutely and pouted. I rendered service. Once again, he lost his balance and started to stumble forward, but I reached out and steadied him before he fell. Thanks, Chief, he said. He took the invoice from the railing and studied it. 100 hours, 5 days. I tried to keep my voice down. There was no way you worked 20 hours a day. Yes, I did, he said. I rendered service, Chief. I was going to bring up the topic of the quality of his work when I thought of a better way of dealing with Louis. I went back to the house and pulled Ramon into the kitchen. When we were alone, I said, Thank you for hiring a crack whore who wants $3,000 for his landscaping services. I pointed out one of the windows at Louis, who was staring up at us. Go out and take care of this. By my calculations, it can't be more than $500. Ramon wrinkled his forehead. Why is he charging so much? He only did half the stuff right, and he took more breaks than he worked. Because he rendered service. I went to the sink and washed my hands. $3,000? You're kidding, right? I wish. I returned to the dining room and passed around more bourbon balls. Okay, so that's where we're going to leave off tonight. No cliffhanger, but I think we've got a cliffhanger coming up. So we're going to start tomorrow night with another Voodoo Day. So more strange coincidences start happening at Widmer House. We hear more bumps and smell more things, and strange things start happening in the house as I meet more strange and interesting people in the neighborhood. So yeah, Charles is a soft 50. Yeah. And this was like 1999, so that's 20 years ago too. So, but yeah, anyone have any questions before we sign out? Got my last little sip of bourbon, so thanks for tuning in. Hope you're all coping well and have an enjoyable Easter weekend planned. It's going to be quiet, I assume. So, yeah, thanks for rendering the service of storytelling, Thomas says. No, Ramon didn't learn his lesson because we had 2 more, and one chapter is about the next guy he hired. And then there was another guy. I don't know if I wrote him in the chapter, but yeah, Ramon hired 3 street people to do our landscaping. So you'll find out more about it. But yeah, so thanks for tuning in. Plan on joining us again tomorrow night. So tonight was lucky number 13. So thanks for all that have been here every night. And if you missed some of the first episodes, you can still watch them on the webpage. Go to Louisville Historic Tours, our channel on YouTube, and you can find them all there. The last ones aren't there yet, but the first 7 are there. And we'll be putting other clips and videos up. Thanks to Sean Stafford again, Hunley Media, for doing all this work for us and helping us get the word out. Like I said, we're working on the T-shirts and merchandise, so keep an eye out for it. Check us out on Louisville Historic Tours. And thanks Thanks for tuning in tonight. Hope you're all doing well. Hey, Ashley, good to see you again. And Marcia, have a good night, a restful night, and enjoy your weekend. And I'll see you all tomorrow night. Hang in there, and love you all. Take care.